I stood in the deafening silence of my living room, keys still digging into my palm, realizing my wife's mother hadn't just cleaned house. She'd systematically erased my entire life while I was recovering from surgery. They locked me in, wired the foundation to blow, and left me a ticking silver box counting up to 0 out our bank account. The silence in the house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the deafening vacuum left behind after a storm, a personal Category 5 hurricane named Brenda and Tiffany. I stood just inside the threshold of what used to be my living room, my keys still clutched so tightly in my hand that the edges of the metal were digging crescent moons into my palm. The door clicked shut behind me, a final hollow sound echoing through the empty space. I had been gone for 3 days. 3 days of forced isolation after a minor, admittedly stress-induced surgery. My wife, Sarah, God bless her, had been an absolute rock, coordinating with her mother, Brenda, who lived just 10 minutes away, to keep an eye on things. Tiffany, Sarah's younger sister, was roped in for moral support and to help with the occasional grocery drop-off. They were family. Trust was the default setting in our world. A setting I now realized I had been criminally naive to maintain. The first thing I noticed wasn't the missing furniture, not immediately anyway. It was the smell, that specific stale scent of aggressive cleaning products mixed with cheap, overpowering perfume. Brenda's signature scent, Midnight Jasmine, assaulted my sinuses before my eyes could even process the devastation. I took a tentative step onto the hardwood floor, which usually gleamed under the midday sun filtering through the large bay window. Today, the sun seemed weak, the light muted by dust motes dancing in the disturbed air. My gaze swept the room, and that's when the reality hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. It wasn't just that things were tidy. It was that things were gone. Where the massive, ridiculously comfortable navy blue sectional sofa had been, the one Sarah and I had argued over for 3 weeks before finally agreeing, was only a clean, square outline on the carpet, stark against the slightly faded surrounding fibers. The massive 75-inch television, the centerpiece of our movie nights, was a gaping black hole on the wall mount, the wires neatly cut and dangling like severed nerves. My custom-built entertainment center, crafted from solid oak by my own grandfather, was reduced to bare studs. A choked sound escaped my throat. It sounded foreign, ragged. I stumbled toward the fireplace, needing something solid to hold onto, and my hand brushed against the mantelpiece. The wedding photo, the professional shot from that perfect autumn day 5 years ago, was missing. In its place, a small, dusty framed picture of Tiffany accepting a participation trophy for a middle school debate club. A cruel, deliberate placeholder. No, this isn't happening, I whispered, turning slowly, forcing myself to absorb the sheer scale of the violation. The bookshelf. Years of accumulated knowledge, first editions, dog-eared paperbacks, and my rare collection of military history texts, all gone. Not even a paperback spine remained. The shelves themselves looked oddly light, scraping marks visible where they had been violently wrenched away from the wall anchors. I moved into the dining room, my pace quickening from disbelief to a frantic, terrifying energy. The antique mahogany dining table, inherited from Sarah's side, was also gone. It was massive. It would have taken at least 2 strong men to move it. Then I looked at the sideboard, Sarah's grandmother's antique piece, filled with our good china, crystal, and heirloom silver. The doors hung open, empty, like gaping mouths. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat signaling imminent panic. I needed to call Sarah. She had to explain this bizarre, meticulous theft. Maybe it was some elaborate, misguided prank she'd organized while I was recovering. But even as the thought formed, the cold, hard logic of the missing items refuted it. No one takes down a wall-mounted TV unless they intend never to see it again. I raced toward the kitchen, hoping for some semblance of normalcy, some untouched corner where I could anchor myself. The kitchen was modern, recently renovated. The granite countertops were clean, too clean, too bare. My high-end stand mixer, the one I used for baking bread every weekend, was missing from its usual spot. The good set of Wusthof knives I'd splurged on was gone from the magnetic strip on the wall. Even the copper pot set, hanging neatly above the island, had vanished, leaving only the bare mounting hooks. This wasn't a robbery. A thief takes jewelry, electronics, easily fenced items. This was systematic erasure. They took the furniture. They took the life. I backed away from the island, breathing hard, my vision tunneling. I looked back toward the hall leading to the bedrooms. I had to check the master suite. That was my last bastion of hope, the one place where Sarah would have surely protected my things. I threw open the master bedroom door. The sight was different here, more personal, more savage. The room hadn't been cleared with the clinical efficiency of the living area. It looked like a tornado had passed through, but one that specifically targeted sentiment and value. Dresser drawers were overturned, clothes strewn everywhere, but the expensive designer bags Sarah loved were gone. The jewelry box from her nightstand was gone. Then I saw my side of the closet. My suits, my carefully curated collection of vintage watches, all gone. And there, lying crumpled on the carpet near the empty space where my dresser used to be, was a small crumpled piece of paper. My hands trembled so violently I nearly tore it as I picked it up. It was a dry cleaning receipt, a receipt from 3 days ago. The date coincided perfectly with the start of my post-op recovery. I smoothed it out, my eyes scanning the items listed. 2 suits, wool blend navy, 3 dress shirts, silk white, 1 leather belt, Italian calfskin. Standard dry cleaning. But scribbled across the bottom in thick black marker was a message. Not Sarah's elegant script, but something heavy and aggressive. It was Brenda's handwriting. The message read, "We took what was ours. Sarah and I talked it over. Don't try to contact her. She needs space from your stress. P.S. We donated the rest of the junk at Goodwill." Donated. My home, systematically stripped bare, labeled as junk. The bile rose in my throat, metallic and hot. They didn't just take things, they actively erased me from Sarah's life, using my vulnerable state as the perfect cover. I gripped the receipt so hard the paper crackled. I needed to call her, needed to demand an explanation for this insanity. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers slick with sweat. I powered it on. No signal. I looked up at the ceiling, realizing the main cable box and router were gone. They'd even cut the internet line. I spun around, adrenaline surging, needing a weapon, a shield, something to fight back the crushing weight of betrayal. My eyes landed on the master bathroom door. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, intending to grab the spare set of car keys from the medicine cabinet. The bathroom was pristine. The high-end marble floor shone under the bare bulb. The expensive toiletries, my shaving kit, Sarah's perfume collection, all gone. But this time, they hadn't left a note. They had left something else. On the pristine white porcelain of the bathtub, arranged deliberately like a sacrificial offering, were the contents of my wallet, my driver's license, my expired Blockbuster card, my debit card, neatly snapped in half. And centered among the debris, placed directly where the drain would be, was my wedding band. It caught the harsh overhead light, dull and mocking. I stared at the ring, then looked up at the empty, silent house. Brenda hadn't just taken the valuables, she had facilitated the removal of my wife, my belongings, and now, my marriage, all while I was literally recovering from surgery. And the kicker? The note claimed Sarah had allowed it. I fell to my knees, the cold of the tile shocking through my thin trousers. I reached out a shaking hand toward the ring, a final piece of evidence that my life had been hijacked. Just as my fingertips brushed the cold gold, I heard it, a heavy, methodical thump from the front door. Not a knock, a solid physical impact, followed by the distinct sound of a deadbolt sliding shut from the outside. I scrambled backward, heart exploding in my chest. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. I was locked in, and whoever was out there was heavy enough to make the whole frame shudder. I looked wildly around the ransacked room, realizing Brenda and Tiffany hadn't just cleaned me out and left. They had ensured I couldn't leave after them. I backed up against the closed bathroom door, listening to the footsteps coming down the hall, slow and deliberate, crunching faintly on the scattered debris of my life. They were coming for me. The footsteps paused just outside the master bathroom doorway. I held my breath. Every muscle locked in preparation for a fight I knew I couldn't win in this state. My mind was screaming 1,000 questions, but the primal part of my brain was focused entirely on identifying the weight of the footfalls, the rhythm. They were too heavy for Tiffany and too measured for Brenda's usual hurried shuffle. These sounded like they were deliberately, almost menacingly taking their time. My eyes darted to the window. It was a large sash window overlooking the quiet suburban street, too high to jump safely without severe injury, especially post-surgery, but it was the only alternative to whatever was waiting on the threshold. I crept toward it, easing the window latch open with excruciating slowness, praying the rusty mechanism wouldn't let out a telltale squeak. The sound of breathing suddenly filled the small space behind me. It wasn't the heavy, ragged breathing of exertion, but a slow, almost contented inhalation, followed by a low, satisfied exhale. It was the sound of someone surveying their work. "Well, well," a voice drawled. It wasn't Brenda's shrill tone, nor Tiffany's nasal whine. This voice was deep, resonant, and utterly unfamiliar. "Look what the cat dragged in." I froze, unable to turn around. The air in the room seemed to thin instantly. I stared out the window, calculating the angle, the time it would take to throw my weight against the glass. "Don't make this messy, buddy," the voice continued, taking another slow step into the bathroom. "We went to a lot of trouble to make this quiet. Your little wife, she's expecting a clean break." My little wife. The words were like acid on my skin. "Where is Sarah?" I demanded, my voice cracking with desperation, finally twisting my head just enough to see the intruder without exposing my entire side. He was large, built like a refrigerator, wearing dark work clothes that didn't quite fit the profile of a simple burglar. He carried no visible weapon, but his presence was weaponized. He was standing right where the linen hamper used to be, blocking the door completely. "Sarah is resting," the man said, a smirk evident even in his shadowed face. "Brenda made sure of that. She's got everything she needs: peace, quiet, and a fresh start away from you." "This is insane," I whispered, shaking my head, trying to find the logic in this nightmare. "What is this, extortion? You can't just lock me in my own house and kidnap my wife?" The man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Kidnap? No. Sarah agreed to the terms. You signed the papers, didn't you? Last month, before your little procedure?" The papers. A cold dread washed over me, far worse than the fear of this hulking stranger. A month ago, amidst the stress of final pre-op appointments and insurance nightmares, Brenda had come over unannounced. She'd brought coffee and forms, claiming they were necessary amendments to a health directive or something equally bureaucratic, assuring Sarah they needed my signature immediately for procedural reasons. Sarah had been exhausted, worried sick about my surgery, and I hadn't read past the first paragraph, trusting the context Sarah had provided. "No," I managed, pushing myself closer to the window edge. "Those were medical forms. You tricked us." "Tricked?" The man tilted his head, mimicking a thoughtful pose. "Brenda calls it proactive asset management. See, the house was in both your names, but you were the primary earner, and frankly, the primary source of Sarah's chronic anxiety. Brenda just finalized the transfer of all movable assets and signed the deed over to Sarah, contingent on immediate separation. Her wording, not mine. You're not getting any of the equity. You're lucky we left you the clothes you're wearing and this lovely piece of prime real estate." He gestured vaguely around the destroyed bathroom. "You can't just steal a house," I yelled, desperation making me reckless. "Oh, we didn't steal it. Sarah signed it over, and since you're still legally residing here, we had to make sure you couldn't just call the authorities. Now, could we?" He took another step, his shadow engulfing the bathtub area. "That's why the door is locked, and why we took your cell phone charger and your emergency credit cards from the safe in the closet. We're not amateurs." My blood ran cold again. The safe. I'd completely forgotten about the small safe hidden behind a loose tile in the linen closet. They hadn't missed a single detail. "I'm calling the police," I declared, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. The man sighed dramatically, pulling a small, sleek device from his pocket. Not a phone, but a specialized tracking unit. He pressed a button. A high-pitched, whining electronic shriek filled the small bathroom. It was agonizing, designed to disable. I clapped my hands over my ears, stumbling blindly away from the source. "That's a frequency jammer," the man explained over the piercing noise. "It disables any signal attempting to leave this property, and it's tuned to a frequency that makes your ears bleed if you're near it. And look, it's built right into the doorbell chime upstairs. Cute, right? Brenda thought so." The noise peaked, driving me to my knees again, gasping for air that felt too thin. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears mixing with the sweat running down my temples. When the shriek finally cut off, the silence that followed was profound, suffocating. I waited, panting, listening for any further sound. Nothing. The man had apparently moved away, back toward the hallway. "You have until sundown to vacate the premises," the voice called from the hallway, now sounding muffled farther away. "We'll be back to check the locks. If you're still here, we'll assume you've accepted the severance package." Severance package. My wedding ring, my home, my wife, all reduced to a severance package. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my side. I had to get out. Sundown was maybe 4 hours away. I staggered out of the bathroom, back into the wreckage of the bedroom. The front door was solid oak, reinforced, and clearly bolted from the outside. The windows were my only option, but the drop was still dangerous. I ran to the closet, ripping through the few remaining shirts until I found what I was looking for. The thick, heavy winter duffel bag Sarah and I used for weekend camping trips. If I couldn't leave through the door or the window, I had to create an exit. I grabbed the bag, shoved the snapped pieces of my license and debit card inside, along with the gold ring. I scanned the room again. I needed leverage. I needed weight. My gaze landed on the heavy, ornate bedside lamp, solid brass, a beautiful antique. It was too heavy to carry, but it was the perfect tool. I dragged the lamp toward the window, my breath catching in my chest with every heave. I positioned it near the glass pane, taking a deep, steadying breath, preparing to shatter the barrier between me and the outside world. Just as I lifted the lamp high above my head, ready to swing, a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump started up again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from under the house. A dull, heavy vibration transmitted directly through the floorboards beneath my feet. It sounded like someone was methodically, slowly, battering the foundation with a sledgehammer. The heavy brass lamp slipped in my sweaty grasp, missing the window entirely. It crashed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening clang, but the noise was instantly swallowed by a terrifying new sound, a high-pitched, grinding screech, as if metal was being torn from concrete, followed by a sickening, prolonged groan from the structure of the house itself. The floor beneath my knees lurched violently upward by a full inch, throwing me sprawling onto my face. I looked up in horror as the ceiling plaster above the closet began to crack in perfect, expanding lines, and I realized they weren't just locking me in. They were actively demolishing the house around me to ensure I couldn't claim anything, not even the salvage rights. The initial upward lurch of the floor was so sudden and violent that for a split second, I thought the entire structure was about to implode. I scrambled backward on hands and knees, adrenaline overriding the surgical pain, crab walking away from the epicenter of the vibration, which seemed to be directly under the main load-bearing wall near the kitchen. The grinding screech intensified, a sound that spoke of stressed steel and splintering wood, a sound no domestic dispute should ever generate. Dust and pulverized drywall rained down from the ceiling. I shielded my face, coughing violently. The house wasn't just being stripped. It was being deliberately, structurally compromised. Brenda and Tiffany hadn't hired thugs to clean out the valuables. They'd hired a demolition crew to erase the very footprint of my existence here. I crawled to the threshold of the master bedroom, peering out into the hallway. The light fixtures were swinging wildly now, casting strobe-like shadows across the walls, which were already scarred with deep, jagged cracks. The heavy thump, thump, thump continued underneath, relentless, mechanical. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, directed at the empty space where the brute had stood. "Stop this! You're going to collapse the whole thing!" No answer, just the sickening symphony of destruction emanating from below. I knew then that the man hadn't just left. He was overseeing the operation from the basement or crawl space, ensuring the structural integrity gave way before sundown. I had to get out. The front door was bolted from the outside. The windows were a high-risk leap. My only hope was the back of the house, through the kitchen and out the mudroom, leading to the small, fenced yard. If I could get outside, I could try to signal for help, or at least get far enough away to survive the collapse. I burst out of the bedroom, sprinting toward the kitchen. The air was thick with concrete dust and the metallic tang of disturbed earth. As I reached the doorway leading into the kitchen, I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. The sliding glass door that led to the small patio in the yard was gone. Not broken, not shattered. Gone. The entire aluminum frame and glass panel had been neatly pulled out of the wall, leaving a yawning rectangular gap open to the bright afternoon sun. It was a clean extraction, suggesting heavy machinery had been involved. Perhaps a small excavator or a boom lift used right outside the property line. Relief flooded me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. Freedom was right there. I stumbled toward the opening, my legs weak, focused solely on putting grass under my feet. But as I reached the edge of the opening, I stopped dead. The yard wasn't a yard anymore. The neat square of lawn, the small patch of vegetable garden Sarah had tended, the wooden privacy fence, all gone. In their place was a massive, freshly dug trench, easily 10 feet deep, running the entire width of the property line, separating my backyard from the neighbor's yard. It looked like a hastily constructed defensive moat, and sitting at the bottom of that trench, half covered in freshly disturbed soil, was the missing antique mahogany dining table, clearly used as some kind of counterweight or barrier. The demolition crew hadn't just taken the contents of the house, they had physically altered the landscape around it. I stood, paralyzed at the threshold, trapped between the imploding interior and the impassable chasm outside. I was in a collapsing, stripped-out concrete box, completely isolated. And then I heard it again, closer now, almost directly behind me, overriding the sound of the subterranean battering. A new sound, a faint rhythmic beep. Beep, beep. Coming from the far corner of the kitchen, near the utility sink, which mercifully seemed untouched by the heavy equipment outside. It was the sound of a timer. Not a loud, jarring timer like the frequency jammer, but the quiet, steady countdown of an electronic device. I whirled around, searching frantically. The beeping was emanating from a small silver metal box sitting innocuously on the countertop where the toaster used to reside. It was sleek, military-looking, and completely out of place in Sarah's kitchen. A tiny red LED light flashed in sync with the beeps. I approached it with extreme caution, my heart sinking into my stomach. This wasn't just asset stripping anymore. This was calculated, lethal malice. They hadn't just wanted me gone. They wanted me eliminated before I could testify. I leaned in, trying to decipher the small digital display. The numbers were counting down with agonizing slowness. 00:07:45, 7 minutes and 45 seconds. I had no idea what the device was, but the context was unmistakable. It was a bomb, or something equally catastrophic, placed in the one room I was likely to use if I panicked and tried to find a hidden escape route. And it was set to go off while the structure was already being weakened from below. My eyes shot to the only remaining functional exit, the front door, which I knew was bolted shut. I had to get back into the hallway, find a tool, anything, and try to smash the deadbolt mechanism before the timer hit 0, or before the foundation finally gave way. I turned to flee back toward the hall, but as I did, I tripped over something large and soft that hadn't been there moments before. I pitched forward, catching myself against the edge of the sink cabinet, and looked down at what had tripped me. It was a thick, high-quality canvas bag, the kind professionals use to transport sensitive equipment. It was unzipped, and lying on top of some oddly shaped padding was a heavy-duty industrial-grade bolt cutter, its jaws gleaming under the kitchen light. It was exactly what I needed to cut the external deadbolt chain. But next to the bolt cutters, neatly folded and tucked into a side pouch, was a small familiar object, Sarah's favorite, slightly worn, emerald green silk scarf, the one I had bought her on our honeymoon in Italy. It was a deliberate calling card, and scrawled across the canvas of the bag, as if written in hurried charcoal, was a single, terrifying sentence. If you cut the chain, the charge below detonates instantly. Choose wisely. The bolt cutters. The means to my escape, placed conveniently within arm's reach, yet undeniably connected to the ticking clock on the counter and the violent groaning of the house structure. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. Brenda and Tiffany hadn't just orchestrated a hostile takeover, they had set a high-stakes trap, designed specifically around my desperate instinct for self-preservation. I stared from the bolt cutters to the silver box counting down 00:07:02 and back to the green silk scarf, the symbol of my broken life lying mockingly beside the tools of my potential doom. They knew me too well. They knew the moment I saw an escape route, I would seize it, regardless of the risk. And they had placed the detonator right next to the lock mechanism they expected me to target. The subterranean battering had momentarily paused, replaced by an unnatural, tense silence, broken only by the relentless beep, beep, beep of the timer. It was a psychological pause, allowing the terror of the impending explosion to steep in my mind. I backed away slowly from the counter, my eyes locked on the timer. 7 minutes. I couldn't disable the device. I had no idea how it worked, and tampering with it was clearly a death sentence. I couldn't leave through the yard. The trench was a 10-foot drop onto what looked like wreckage. The front door was the only way out, but using the cutters meant instant ignition. I needed information. I needed to know why Sarah had signed away everything, and why this had escalated to structural demolition and potential murder. My only lead was the note from Brenda, the one claiming Sarah had agreed to the separation. But Sarah wouldn't willingly leave me like this, not after 5 years of marriage, not without a word, unless she was being held against her will. My gaze swept the wrecked kitchen again. They had taken everything of tangible value. But what if they missed something truly small, something that wasn't meant to be found? I remembered the small, almost invisible emergency button I'd installed months ago near the pantry, a panic button linked to an untraceable encrypted satellite phone Sarah kept charged in case of severe weather. It was hidden beneath a false bottom in the spice rack, designed to be activated by a specific sequence of spice jars being pushed in rapid succession. It was a long shot, but the only shot that didn't involve cutting a chain connected to C4. I stumbled over to the pantry, my injured side protesting every movement. The spice rack was still there, miraculously untouched, perhaps deemed too insignificant to bother with. My hands shook violently as I located the jars: cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom. 000558. The beeping seemed louder now, sharper. I began the sequence, pushing the jars in the pre-arranged pattern, holding each one down for precisely 2 seconds. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, cinnamon. I repeated the sequence 3 times. Nothing happened. I tried again, faster this time, fueled by panic. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, cinnamon, cinnamon, nutmeg. On the final press of the cardamom jar, I heard a faint metallic click from the back of the rack. A tiny compartment slid open, revealing the small, rugged satellite phone. Thank God. I snatched it up, my thumb hovering over the power button. If the jammer was still active, this phone wouldn't work, but it was designed to bypass localized interference, intended for true emergencies. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, displaying a full signal bar and a single incoming message. 000-430. I opened the message. It wasn't from the police or a lawyer or even Sarah. It was a text sent from an unknown number, clearly intended for me. The message contained a single grainy photograph. It was taken inside a vehicle, dimly lit. In the driver's seat was Sarah, looking pale and terrified, her wrists visibly bound with zip ties. Her eyes, however, were locked directly onto the camera lens. She wasn't screaming, but her expression held a profound, desperate plea. And sitting beside her, grinning widely at the camera, was Tiffany. But it wasn't the picture itself that made my lungs seize up. It was what Sarah was subtly doing with her left hand, visible only if you knew what to look for. With her bound fingers, she was trying to manipulate a loose thread on the car's headliner, drawing it down slowly, trying to form a symbol. She managed to pull one full thread loose, creating a distinct downward-pointing arrow shape on the dark fabric above Tiffany's head. An arrow pointing down, down, the foundation, the trench, the bomb timer. The implications hit me with devastating clarity. Sarah was alive. She was a captive, and she was trying to communicate that the immediate danger wasn't the external bolt, but the structural collapse, or the device hidden beneath the house, directly related to the hole outside. She wasn't telling me to run. She was warning me to stay put, or at least to avoid the obvious escape routes. 00:02:15. The subterranean thumping abruptly resumed, louder and more violent than before, accompanied by the terrifying sound of heavy timber snapping. The entire house shuddered violently, and a section of the ceiling plaster in the hallway collapsed with a loud crack. If the structure failed now, I would be crushed instantly. If I stayed put, the timer would likely detonate something connected to the foundations. I looked at the bolt cutters lying inches from the counter edge, then at the satellite phone in my hand, my only confirmed link to Sarah, who was warning me away from the external escape. I had to choose between the immediate threat of crushing weight and the measured threat of the bomb. I grabbed the bolt cutters anyway, not to use on the door, but to use on the silver box. If I couldn't stop the threat outside, I had to neutralize the known one inside. I raised the massive jaws over the timer, prepared to smash the electronics. 00:00:59. Just as I brought the cutters down, the satellite phone in my other hand erupted with a notification, a new message from the unknown sender. My focus broke for a millisecond, drawn by the illuminated screen. The new message was a single short audio file attached. Instinctively, I tapped it open just as the bolt cutters made contact with the casing of the silver box. The sound that blasted from the tiny satellite speaker was not a voice, nor an alarm. It was the distinct piercing sound of a car horn, held down in a continuous, desperate blare, overlaid with the muffled sound of Tiffany screaming, "Stop, Sarah, stop it!" And in that same instant, the jaws of the bolt cutters crushed the timer, the screen instantly going dark. But instead of an explosion, the house went completely, unnervingly still. The grinding from below ceased. The shaking stopped. The silence was absolute, suggesting a circuit had been broken, either the timer or the primary structural charge below. I stood there, cutters raised, heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the secondary device to blow. Nothing happened. I looked down at the now inert silver box, then back at the green scarf, then to the phone still playing the sound of Sarah's desperate struggle. Then, through the sudden, profound silence, a new sound began, much fainter than the structural groans, but growing steadily louder, clearer, as if approaching from the outside world, the unmistakable rising wail of approaching sirens. The police were coming. But before I could celebrate, a small, almost imperceptible ripple ran across the surface of the dead silver box where the timer had been. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, a tiny plume of thick, acrid white smoke began to curl out from the crushed casing. It wasn't burning. It smelled sterile, chemical, like an industrial gas. And as the smoke thickened, a new digital display flickered to life on the side of the metal casing that the cutters had not touched. It wasn't counting down. It was counting up, and the number displayed was 1. The sight of the white, sterile smoke curling from the crushed timer and the new counter ticking upwards from 1 paralyzed me. The relief of the silence and the approaching sirens evaporated, replaced by a chilling certainty that I had just traded one immediate death for another, more insidious one. The bolt cutters hadn't disarmed the situation, they had triggered the secondary phase. The upward ticking counter was too slow, too deliberate to be a standard explosive detonation timer. It felt like a biological or chemical dispersal sequence. The sterile smell of the smoke confirmed it wasn't gunpowder. It was something meant to incapacitate silently. Perhaps a neurotoxin designed to look like a structural failure had merely stunned me. The sirens were close now, distinct wails of authority cutting through the suburban quiet. My window of opportunity was closing, measured now not in minutes, but in the spread of the gas. I dropped the bolt cutters. They clattered onto the counter beside the still playing looped sound clip of Sarah's struggle and Tiffany's panicked scream. I snatched the satellite phone again, ignoring the noxious fumes swirling around the defunct timer. Sarah's message, the arrow pointing down, was the key. Don't go out. The immediate danger is structural/underground. The primary charge hadn't blown because the structural failure they caused had forced a safety cutoff, or because my intervention with the cutters had severed a different primary circuit. But the secondary device, the chemical dispersal unit, was clearly tied to the failure of the primary system. The house groaned again, but this time it was softer, a settling sound, not a snap. The demolition crew had stopped, perhaps alerted by the sirens, or perhaps satisfied that the gas dispersal was underway. I looked at the gaping hole where the patio door had been, the 10-foot trench below. If the gas spread quickly, the trench might offer a brief pocket of clean air, however briefly, before I was crushed by whatever collapse came next. It was the lesser of 2 fatal risks. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I kicked the inert silver timer box with my good foot, sending it skittering across the tile, hoping to contaminate the gas source if the authorities analyzed it later. Then, I turned my back on the front door, on the promise of easy rescue, and lunged toward the open void of the backyard. I didn't dare jump. I used my arms, grabbing the edge of the remaining aluminum door frame, swinging my legs out over the precipice. The drop was treacherous, but using the remaining door jamb for support, I lowered myself, foot by foot, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs, until my boots found purchase on the soft, churned earth of the trench floor. I landed hard, stumbling sideways, landing against the cool, solid bulk of the mahogany dining table. The air down here was stale, smelling of damp soil and motor oil, but distinctly cleaner than the chemical haze billowing out of the kitchen window above me. 2. The gas counter ticked upwards. I huddled there, leaning against the table, trying to regulate my breathing. I was trapped in a ditch, covered in dirt, but for the moment, I was breathing unfiltered air. I looked up at the house. The kitchen window was now spewing a steady, visible plume of white gas, clearly visible in the afternoon light. The sirens were close enough now that I could hear the distinct crunch of tires on gravel in the driveway. Uniform voices were shouting, echoing off the stripped-out shell of the house. "Police! We have reports of suspicious activity and structural damage. Anyone inside, respond now!" I tried to shout back, but my throat was too raw, my lungs too constricted from the dust and fear. I banged weakly on the mahogany table with my fist, hoping the noise would carry. The shouting stopped. A moment of silence. Then a beam of high-powered tactical light swept across the trench, illuminating my miserable figure huddled beneath the gaping maw of the house. "We have a victim down in the trench. Do not move, sir. We are coming down!" A voice yelled, closer and authoritative. Relief crashed over me so fiercely I nearly wept. I was found. I was safe. But as the first officer began scrambling down the rough-cut edge of the trench, preparing to rappel down with a rope, I noticed something the officer's flashlight beam illuminated just beyond the dining table. A thin, almost invisible line running from the table, tautly stretched across the trench floor, disappearing under the dirt on my side. And attached to that line, right beside my head, was a tiny pressurized canister, no bigger than a lipstick tube, connected to the main structural beam that was groaning under the settling weight. It was perfectly disguised in the disturbed soil. The officer shouted again, "Sir, stay right where you are, don't touch anything." But I saw the connection. The upward ticking counter wasn't measuring gas dispersal. It was measuring the time until the secondary explosive charge, linked to the tension wire, detonated. The gas was a distraction. The trench was a containment field. They wanted me cornered when the final charge went off, ensuring that when the sirens arrived, they would find only rubble and ash. 3. The upward counter flickered. I had seconds. I couldn't wait for the officer to reach me. I couldn't stay near the wire. I rolled away from the table, pushing myself backward with desperate force, trying to create slack in the wire, trying to pull the detonator away from its target point. The officer shouted, alarmed by my sudden movement, mistaking my desperate attempt to save myself for an attack. "He's moving! Get down!" The officer lunged forward, reaching for me just as I managed to clear the line. I felt the tug on the wire as I rolled free, and then, instead of an explosion, I heard a sharp snap, the sound of the tension wire breaking, followed by a loud, sharp hiss from the canister. The canister didn't explode. Instead, a thick, highly viscous, clear gel began to spray rapidly from the ruptured device, coating the dining table and the earth around it. It hardened almost instantly, turning the area into a sticky, impenetrable trap. The officer reached me an instant later, grabbing my arm firmly. "Sir, what happened? What was that?" I gasped, pointing back at the hardening gel encapsulating the table. It was a failsafe. They were trying to bury me. As the first officer secured me and helped me climb awkwardly out of the trench, more police cars were arriving. The white smoke was beginning to dissipate from the kitchen window as the cold air rushed in through the open entry points. When we reached the driveway, a supervisor met us. "What's the situation, Officer Reyes? We had reports of imminent collapse." Reyes pointed back at me. "Sir is injured, likely exposed to some sort of incapacitating agent, but he's lucid. He claims his in-laws tried to demolish the house and gas him while his wife was allegedly abducted." Just then, a patrol car pulled up sharply, lights flashing, having circled the block. A detective leaned out of the passenger window, looking directly at me. We just pulled over a vehicle matching the description of a nervous blonde woman, driving erratically about a mile away. We have Tiffany in custody. She was hysterical, claiming her mother, Brenda, had gone completely insane and was trying to burn down the marital home while Sarah was locked in the trunk of her car. My breath hitched. Sarah. "The trunk?" I whispered, adrenaline surging back, sharper than any pain. "Yes, sir. She was found alive but disoriented, tied up inside. We're transporting her to the ambulance now. Tiffany claims Brenda forced her to help clear out the house, threatening to use the chemicals on Sarah if she refused, but Tiffany panicked when Brenda started rigging the structure. As the EMTs rushed Sarah, pale but breathing, wrapped in a shock blanket, across the lawn toward their vehicle, she caught sight of me standing there, dirt-caked and bleeding, next to the ruined husk of our home. She broke free from the EMT's gentle hold and stumbled toward me. "Mark!" she cried, throwing her arms around my neck, clinging desperately. "Oh God, Mark, I tried so hard to tell you. The arrow!" I held her tight, burying my face in her hair, the smell of sterile gas finally fading beneath the familiar scent of her skin. "I saw it, Sarah. I understood. But what about the upward counter? What was that?" She pulled back slightly, her eyes wide and haunted, still looking toward the ruined house. "That wasn't a bomb timer, Mark. That was the sequence for the remote activation of the bank transfer codes. Brenda made me sign the final paperwork while I was locked in the car. Once the initial external bolt was thrown, the house system, the one we installed for security, was hijacked. It wasn't counting down to an explosion. It was counting up to 0 out our joint accounts. When you smashed the timer, you must have fried the remote signal." We stood there, clinging to each other on the scorched lawn as police swarmed the foundation, investigating the chemical residue and the massive hole in the earth. The house was gone, the life we built inside it reduced to rubble and soil. But as Sarah squeezed my hand, her fingers finding mine instinctively, I realized they had failed to erase the most valuable asset, the connection that survived the wreckage. We'd lost everything tangible, but we had survived the trap, and finally we were together, outside the perimeter of their control. The fight for recovery would be long, but we would face it together, an unbroken unit against the wreckage Brenda and Tiffany had left behind.